Thanks for checking out another new podcast from the Association for Materials Protection and Performance. Of course, we're best known as AMP for short. As always, I'm your host, Ben Dubose, news editor with the AMP publications team. In that role, I create content for both Coatings for Magazine and Materials Performance Magazine, both of which are member magazines of AMP. Today, we're chatting with Terry Greenfield, principal consultant at Constellex. Terry is a past chairman of AMP, a past president of NACE International, and he is also AMP's accredited representative to the International Maritime Organization, or IMO for short. Terry, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. And let's start with introductions. I mentioned some of your highlights, but I know you can certainly expand a bit more. Generally speaking, for anyone listening who doesn't know the Terry Greenfield story, what's your career arc been?
You've already hit kind of some of the high points, but just to kind of give a background, we started out quite a while ago now. It's like 47 years in the contracting world, got involved with NACE International on the inspection side, evolved into an engineering firm, and I've been involved basically with projects worldwide ever since. I'm working a lot of work in Asia, oil and gas, the Middle East with pipeline, the U.S. with pipeline. So I've had the pleasure to be able to move across a lot of different industries and see that those experiences and how they can be moved and leveraged for other industries. So, again, the time with NACE as an instructor and course development in various aspects was very important, and it's just been quite a ride here. I joke about being a graybeard now. I never quite expected, to be 66 and again, have 47 years in the industry. But it's been good to me. It's been a good ride. I've met a lot of good people, had a lot of interesting problems to solve, and generally, I think have been pretty successful in solving them. So I don't know if that covers the whole arc, but it kind of hits some of the key issues. Today, I do still specification development, failure analysis, forensics, and expert witness as required. Unfortunately, as long as we've spent trying to always show the right way to do things, but we still keep doing them the wrong way. So that unfortunately takes up a lot of time. Wish we could change that.
For sure. So we mentioned your experience as a delegate to the International Maritime Organization. What are the ways that global standards that are issued by organizations such as AMP can influence the corrosion prevention strategies for naval and commercial fleets? What are some of the international initiatives that perhaps the U.S. should adopt more aggressively?
Well, it's interesting. One of the things that really with military shipping, the life cycle of a warship or even, some of the supporting ships is typically designed to be longer than most commercial shipping, sometimes 2 to 3 times. So there's always been a lot of good development and understanding of how to do things better with the Navy, primarily the Navy here, the U.S. Navy that I'm familiar with. And they've made a lot of advancement in achieving that, but there's always room. I mean, if you look at the number today it's a little bit of a guesstimate, but I think it's still about 20% of the budget for maintenance is spent on coatings and corrosion issues. So there's improvement. And I think when we see the industry, commercially is starting to grasp the idea, it's really exciting to see they're starting to grasp the idea of life cycle extension. And I know some of the ship owners groups that I've had conversations with are actually starting to look at the considerations of corrosion management and the things to make it more effective. So in looking, primarily a lot of the work has been in extension of where, tanks, ballast tanks and other tankage for cargo, where it's most susceptible and how they've looked at specification development, and not so much the materials, but a lot of it being the process itself. But I think, that there's always improvement, and I think there's potential for looking at what some of the approach is with, especially the coatings application for ships, tanks, and things along those lines. There's definitely opportunity to probably improve the process for the military as well. But again, they've been aware of a lot of these issues, and again, to date, there hasn't been a lot of interaction really between those two segments so much. If this new initiative moves forward with the shipbuilding in the U.S. to be beyond just military, but back to commercial, we'll probably see a good opportunity for that integration and kind of see where it goes.
Yeah, and with any new administration, there's opportunities to look at things with a fresh set of eyes, and so there's been lots of meetings, lots of talk on Capitol Hill in recent weeks that I know AMP can potentially play a role in. I'm sure we'll touch on that as we move our way through this podcast, but I want to start with the science of how all of this works, because you've got a lot of expertise throughout your career in failure analysis, forensic investigations. So, with that in mind, what are some of the most common corrosion related failures that you typically see in shipbuilding and fleet maintenance? And what are the ways that the industry can hopefully proactively address those risks before they become really costly failures?
You know, most of the efforts to resolve issues that have occurred relate a lot to the tank world. As far as, but again, we've talked about ballast tanks, cargo tanks, anything that contains something, just because of the nature of its use, that typically it's not something that sees the light of day that often, where there's no opportunity for visual assessment in a continuous basis, where if you saw something that was problematic on the hull or the top sides or a lot of exposed areas, it's easy to address the maintenance issues to go with that, right? To schedule it and get it fixed. So that's really where you see most of the problems, especially in the commercial side. And even with some of the requirements for inspection, there's still problems that occur in sometimes material selection, especially with cargo tankers, where there's, different materials that would be contained in the tanks. And there's even a lot that goes through all coatings are permeable. So there's the element of what from the cargo that could still be contained within the coating film that could potentially react with a different cargo. And even the cleaning processes that they go through to try to minimize that effect, there's potentially problems with the cleaning. So, there's looking at it from the ballast tanks, there's the material selection, again, making sure that I don't want to, innovation is important, right? We're always looking for better materials, but it's typically, there is no magic material. There are good materials and materials that can be effective for certain environments and applications, but a lot of it comes back into the process of selection, the engineering side, and then the installation. Okay. As far as making sure that's the best opportunity. If you want to get an extended life cycle, or at least the expected service life, your best opportunity in doing that is to make sure that it's properly installed. And that's, good training, good application practices, and truthfully good inspection too, to make sure that the specification that was developed for that is adequate and sufficient to ensure that end goal is achieved. So that's really where you see the biggest problems. And there's also, just generally things that anything that's, structural in nature, overheads and decks, things that are hard to coat, there's opportunity there to really ensure that it's done properly the first time and it's coated adequately, because those areas become more difficult to do maintenance with. Again, it's the process. It's really the avoidance of those problems is the process of understanding the environment that it's going to have to provide service in with coating selection. I'll speak back on design as well in just a minute, but good coating selection for the environment has got to be installed, and then it's properly installed. And then there's always going to be some level of maintenance. So having, with tanks, it's typically you're going to get in and take a look at it at some regulated point in time. For commercial, military, it could vary, but it's going to be important to get in and see how things are performing. If there is a problem, to deal with it quickly. And then ideally you could eliminate future problems. So there's always that, probably anytime a new coating is installed, there's an advantage to getting a quick look at it after a year's service and seeing, what may be a problem, and then fix that problem. And you may see years after that with no real additional problems.
So I mentioned earlier that AMP definitely has a role in this process through the development of standards pertaining to protective coatings and corrosion control. Yet AMP and organizations like AMP can develop all the quality standards in the world, and yet there can still be challenges when it comes to actually getting those implemented across shipyards and the Navy and really the entire commercial maritime sector. It's one thing to have the standards, but to properly implement them is another matter altogether. So, as you see it, what are the ways to hopefully close the gap between the best practices that organizations like AMP are trying to provide guidance on and then the actual on the ground execution?
If that's a great question because, there's so much when we look at things, we speak about sustainability and all these great terms and it's great ideas, but it's the implementation and the conviction to the implementation that is really the most important. And, looking at it from the complete picture, you just really got to have the commitment at the highest level. If it's commercial shipping, at the highest level within the owners, that they recognize that. Because to some extent with commercial shipping, one of the challenges is to do it right costs a little more money up front sometimes. It's an investment. There's a great ROI, but it does cost a little more money. And commercial is always typically looking at, the lowest cost for implementation, right? So you got to have that commitment on commercial at the highest level, that they see the value and they communicate that commitment all the way down to, as you say, on the ground, the boots on the ground, they're actually implementing it from the military standpoint. That is again where there has to be that same commitment. There's a greater understanding. And again, a lot of what they do, regardless, is to achieve a longer life cycle. That has been typical for commercial. But it's got to be the commitment. If everyone at the bottom, I always kind of look at people when I'm doing training. It is just kind of an analogy. When you're doing training with people, that you're telling them how to do it, and they, try to focus on just the doing it. But what I've found is if you really explain to them what the consequence of not doing it correctly is, then they start to have a better understanding of why you have to do it right. That they're not just steps on a piece of paper. They have real world consequence if they're not properly implemented. So, that's kind of key there, is that communication all the way through the program, be it commercial or military, that why you're trying to do what you're doing and what the rewards are and what the consequences are if you don't accomplish that. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also curious your perspective about all of this from the technology side, because you certainly got your experience with AMP and with the IMO, yet you've also got a lot of experience over the years from time in the field, actually performing work. And as a certified coding specialist yourself, how do you see the advancements in coding technologies as well as application techniques? How do you see those improving the durability of ships? And are there new or emerging technologies within coatings that could perhaps extend the lifespan even more moving forward?
It's for years there was looking at new technologies. First, we'll kind of go back to the design and the actual material. You're using, steels that had, low corrosive activity. Again, there's always a cost associated with that. They saw some promise. I know in Asia, they were working on some of those materials and others have been, it's the idea. I always remember our start was back in Kennedy Space Center and basically supporting the launch structures. And there was a young, I think he was a lieutenant in the Air Force, that had taken over part of the program, and, a lot of enthusiasm. And his first question was, well, why don't we build them out of titanium? If we built them out of titanium, then they would, they'd last forever. We wouldn't have these corrosion problems. Well, what do you think the problem is? It's the cost, right? There's that balancing the result versus what the cost is. So that's why I think a lot of the other materials, as far as the structure itself, haven't necessarily evolved beyond carbon steel, because it does the job very well. It's easy to work with, and there's a lot of benefits. It just wants to return to its natural state, especially in a marine environment. So we typically do use coatings, and they've always been working on different coatings. Again, epoxies are the workhorse, looking at different materials. And I want to be careful how I approach this, because it's not meant to be derogatory in any means, but manufacturers tend to look at the marketing aspects of things as well, right? And you get the latest, greatest material, and sometimes those materials, when introduced, you've got to be very careful because they have an anticipated performance, but they don't have a performance record. So it's that caution we use as we move forward with new technologies, new materials, to make sure that they really are going to perform as expected. We've used other materials. We learned a lot about, polysiloxanes, which that's typically used a lot more today on, top sides on the hull and areas for, performance and color retention. But we also learned a lot of potential application issues the hard way. So I think we've addressed most of those now. So that's kind of always there's a balance between, I've always heard people kind of talk, well, one day we're going to have a magic coating that we're going to be able to not have to do hardly any surface preparation and apply it to the surface, and it's going to perform for 50 years. Maybe, but the process in getting there is what's going to be challenging. And in doing that, making good decisions along the way, we're going to use a lot of materials that we've got, tried and true performance records with. And the key issue being we can achieve those longevity, life cycle, service life, by just having good process for the installation, good process for selecting the right material and then installing the material properly and then doing maintenance throughout that process. So, didn't really want to take the rug out from underneath what might be a magic new technology coming, but really a lot of it is just improvement. Now I haven't kept up here recently, but I know there was some point in time where some of the shipyards were looking at, some robotic installation for coatings and other elements to try to be more consistent in how they approach that. So, there's always something, but you've always got to look at new technologies very carefully to make sure that it's really the one that's going to add advantage to the process.
So you touched on the cost pressures a couple of times in that answer, one case being with the titanium, yet there's also a staggering economic cost to the corrosion itself. There's billions that get spent each and every year on maintenance and repairs for these vessels. So if you could explore the economic impact a little more, effectively managing that corrosion directly impacts certainly the economic sustainability, but also the national security and larger implications.
Great question. And I guess the titanium versus carbon steel is an extreme situation.
Sure.
Okay. But it does kind of highlight, that discussion. And I guess I've really been a big proponent of corrosion management, meaning there's been a couple good articles written and different things going forward, but as we're starting to look at that and what that really means, what corrosion management is really looking at, the big picture, where we're really trying to see what we want to do and what we potentially could do. But then it's really putting everything in place. Again, we've already talked about selection and all those issues and installation, but it really comes down to making sure that we're watching it, that we're doing assessments. And the Navy, again, it has a program in place. Matter of fact, NACE International put the shipboard corrosion assessment training program into place, and that was implemented with, I know, the carrier group has some software systems that they use to help manage what they're looking at, what's being done, where there's corrosion, where there's problems, when the work was done, what's it going to cost? I mean, that's a big effort, and it's a great effort and a great way to spend, that little extra money, because you're effectively, I think, long-term going to save a lot of money. You're going to see that's the balance, is because, again, we talked about it, especially with commercial shipping, of always looking at that build cost, that initial investment versus, the long-term operating costs. And I think if you look at and really consider the long-term operating costs, that additional initial investment can go a long way into making life a lot easier. And especially with, warship readiness, you want to, they're even looking beyond that too. I think it was the Army, I remember 10 years ago, it started a program even looking at their vehicles to make sure that they were dealing with corrosion issues to keep them in a high state of readiness. And I think that's the real benefit. The commercial side can see financial benefit over time. The military will see financial benefit as well as that readiness effort of knowing that you're not going to have unexpected events. That's what you don't want. And really, you don't want that in any industry, but it's the staying on top of the situation with the management piece and really being aware of where you may have potential problems. I mean, risk-based inspection, you can put that together to know where you have had problems, to know where you need to look. So, and to make sure that's not going to be a problem. So, the management piece really becomes very important to really achieve those goals that you're looking for with, long-term sustainability, readiness, whatever you want to call it. But it's a management system to make sure that you're accomplishing what you intended to accomplish and you're ready for what may come up in the future.
And when we talk about the concept of management, we're implicitly talking about people, and specifically the people that go out and install these systems. And I think that's sort of the last part of this equation. You need the technologies, you need the standards and guidance for how to best use them, and you also need the people to go out and actually apply these systems to the assets we're talking about. So you've had a lot of experience in the industry, more than 40 years. And so you've gotten a firsthand look at how the needs of this industry have evolved from a workforce standpoint. And you hear workforce development all the time as one of the big buzzwords. We have the AMP annual conference coming up in April, and I'm sure there'll be 10 plus sessions pertaining to workforce development in some way or another. So from your perspective, to make sure that these technical standards and technologies are followed in the field, what are the most challenging things right now when it comes to training and recruiting the next generation of corrosion professionals so that we can ensure that these technologies are used the right way? And how should an organization like AMP, as well as the member leaders, the industry leaders within it, ensure that knowledge transfer, skill development, all those types of things are able to keep pace with these newer technologies?
That's a big one.
Yeah, I gave you like 3 questions in one there, but they're all interrelated, so I figured it makes sense that way.
And it did. And I'll break it down a little bit because one of the things first, I mean, I'll look at it from the applicators is a good one to look at because typically we don't always associate the skill level requirements with those folks, the technicians doing the installation as we should. I mean, it really is that having someone that really understands it, takes pride in their work, that has a lot of value. But but very often what happens is you see the companies that do the installation that recognize that, and they start training their people because they want to make sure they have the right people doing the work. It's more efficient for them. They don't have to do rework. But in doing that, you also have to understand, then they understand, some of them, that they've got to have retention. They train. One of the old models was they would invest in training for people and have them better, get them certified, and then they would go off and find a better job. And that was on the inspection side as well. So there was always sometime a resistance within industry to do that training, just because that after they invest in the training, they may lose the people that they had trained. And there's a lot of other aspects of that, but that's kind of the fundamental piece. So there's a next piece too. A lot of that changes if it's required. If it becomes, regulatory. Commercial shipping required for the ballast tanks under the performance standard for protective coatings. They required inspectors to be, one of the groups that fit that requirement were the NACE at the time coating inspectors, and now the AMP coating inspectors. But they required it. So it became something that everybody building a commercial ship, had to deal with. And it just became part of the process. So I think there's a key element there that it's required. And a lot of the military pieces, you see that it is required. So, that's kind of a fundamental piece, is you've got to have the next step being a requirement for the applicators, that they have sort of certain certifications and they move up through that group. Okay. Where they're actually, I know AMP has that training, and it can fulfill that. But that really, and that sounds like a selling point, or trying to make a sell for the AMP, the training piece, but not really. I mean, it's true that it's actually, that's what needs to happen. Whoever was providing the training, that's what needs to happen, is that they need to require the certifications for application to ensure that's going to be done. And that's not a full, there's various aspects with the QP programs for the applicators themselves. I mean, the application companies. So again, there's kind of has to be a better understanding and implementation, a lot of those pieces to actually get that requirement. But if you really look at that, the training, I saw there was an article that came out in Defense Daily that noted that the shipbuilding industry needs to hire about 25,000 new trade workers per year over the next decade to meet requirements. A lot of that's because of attrition, people going, but that's a pretty big number. And those are generally pretty good jobs, but they're trade jobs too, which I don't know. There hasn't. I think there's a new trend in seeing people wanting to get their hands dirty again for having a trade that can pay very well. A good job. Longevity. A lot of these shipyards themselves, people have worked there, and some of their kids have worked there. So I mean, it's a good process, but people have to want to get the training and step into that role. So I think some of it is getting the message out of that those are good jobs, and they're going to, especially if this renaissance of shipbuilding in the U.S. comes about, there's going to be a huge need. And one of the things that was really interesting in the article too is, we think about that as being the blasters and the painters and the other aspects, but they were talking about the shipyards needing even more, but they were calling new collar generation workers, which was things, like the 3D printing and advanced technology within manufacturing and other elements too. So, the understanding, I think, really what those jobs are going to be, and helping people, again, reaching out to them when they're in that later high school phase or otherwise, where they're trying to look at what good opportunities are. That was like, welding. I always kind of got a kick out of watching, friends' kids, the ones that went to college, and then there was a couple of them that went into welding and plumbing and other things, and seeing how well they're doing, financially. It wasn't, we had created this idea that the only way you could be successful was, to go to college. Well, looking at these potential trades as they develop, and they are well-paying trades, and getting, kids in high school to see that. And I think there is some outreach to that and how we're going about it. But again, you have to define the jobs, and then let those that can fulfill the jobs through the training be aware of them, and then put the training together that allows them to reach those goals. And I think a lot of that's in place. I think, AMP's going to be in a good position to provide a lot of that, especially on the coding application portion. So, and we haven't even talked about cathodic protection and a lot of those issues that tie in as well. But that's, again, that they need to know about the jobs. The jobs need to be well defined, and they need to be presented as what they are, that they could be a good career for someone that's looking, to develop that career pathway.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a recent podcast with a couple of guys from the IUPAT, Ken Seal and Andrew Kroll, and they were talking about that very issue of making sure that trades are better represented to young people as a realistic career path, that there's a lot of their members that see the value in it, but making sure that it's being communicated on a broader scale to the masses when they're, in their formative years, when it comes to deciding what their career is going to be and the trajectory of their life. It needs to be more visible. And so I'm sure that's going to be talked about at conference next week. I want to ask you about that, but I want to follow up first on what you said about cathodic protection. What are some of the unique aspects there, and how does that play into all of this?
Or are we looking at strictly the maritime piece, or are we looking kind of at cathodic protection in general as a trade?
I would say in general, because we were talking about, workforce development. So certainly it can apply to maritime, but more broadly, just the unique aspects of cathodic protection.
That was just kind of a quick little story. They had, recently I reached out to a friend. We needed some help on a project out in Texas on the CP side. And it was really just kind of a helper, but it was well paying, I think. Okay. But we were trying to find someone to do it. It was only for a couple weeks. And a good friend of mine, I talked with her, and her son was available, and he had just finished up, I think, 2 years of college and was just really trying to figure out what he wanted to do. And again, I'm, the sharing a little bit, I think it's all pretty accurate, but he didn't really want to be behind a desk. And he was really kind of and he went out and did it and found that I think he kind of liked it. And that was a very rudimentary element of what on the CP side, but I think he liked being in the field. He liked that things change. And then I think he may actually kind of pursue looking at the certifications process within CP to get some of the basic certifications there, because those jobs are available. I mean, that's an industry that you've got to be the person that wants to be outside and doing that kind of work. But if that's what you want to do instead of sitting behind a desk, then it's great. So there's plenty. I mean, within the pipeline industry, again, even if the shipbuilding goes, there's still, impressed current systems are used in shipping as well as galvanic systems and those elements. So there's no overabundance of people ready to do that work. So and again, that's a very, different aspect because compared to coding application, but it's still technical, and it's got, there's a lot of value in it as a career.
So the last question I've got for you, we're all going to be in Nashville. Well, I say all, definitely the two of us, and hopefully a lot of people listening, a lot of the membership base. We're going to be in Nashville from about the 5th or 6th through the 10th for AMP's annual conference. And when we spoke last, I think 2 or 3 months ago, you had told me that you wanted your conference experience this year to be a little bit different, that rather than be booked up going in, you wanted to keep your dance card relatively empty so that you could actually, go around to sessions, have some flexibility to meet with people on whatever topics are of note that week. I'm sure the shipbuilding initiative that we've been talking about over the last 30 minutes or so, that's going to be one of those things that you want to hear about. But I guess with conference looming just a few days away, what do you expect to talk about? What do you want to talk about? What do you think and hope your week ultimately looks like in Nashville?
The only talking I've agreed to do is I am going to do a session for the education department on, development for I don't know, an hour. I think it's an hour session. Everything else is going to be a lot of listening, some conversation. But I really do want to look at the Marine TIC and some of the discussions we've had with them as far as getting them to be a primary help to the IMO effort. We're really trying with the IMO effort, we're really trying to spread it through the organization, both members and staff, and so we can really support it efficiently. And that's really, I haven't gone through the list yet, but the other thing is, like I said, new technologies, new ideas, some different problem solving things. I really want to try to take advantage of this one to be able to have the flexibility to just kind of go through the app and mark up my schedule for attendance at certain events. And I haven't really gone through that completely because it's realistic. I probably do it on the plane there, but I have made a few notes in some of the programs. But again, this one for me is going to be a lot about seeing and listening to what the new and the floor. I want to spend some time on the showroom floor with products and materials and vendors. That's always been probably with everything that I used to have to do, I'd do a mad dash on the last couple hours just to try to get through and see it. So I'm going to spend, a lot more time and get to talk to some people, as far as the vendors, within the show itself. So that's a big plan. I would encourage everyone to do that.
Terry, for anyone that wants to get in touch with you, how should they do that? If they want to inquire about potentially meeting up with you, or they just want to, ask you a question, perhaps in response to something you've covered on this podcast, what's the best way that somebody can get in touch with Terry Greenfield?
I think my email is pretty public on the Consolex website, but it's Terry, Terry.Greenfield. People ask me, how do you spell that? It's the color green followed by field. Okay. Greenfield at Consolex, CONSULEX.com.
Good stuff. And the conference website, I'll throw this in as a plug before we close out, ace.amp.org. That stands for Annual Conference Expo. That's got all the latest information as far as the schedules, everything going on in Nashville for almost a full week. Go to ace.amp.org to plan your event, just like I'm sure Terry will be doing on his flight out in a few days. Terry, thanks so much for taking the time.
Ben, it was always a pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely. Good stuff there from Terry Grinfield. And with that, we'll bring this episode to a close. On behalf of AMP, I'm Ben Dubose. And if you want more resources from us or our publication brands within the association, just visit amp.org, ampp.org, coatingspromag.com, or materialsperformance.com. You check out those news sections and you'll see lots of the most timely and pertinent developments related to the shipbuilding initiative and other things that we've been discussing on this podcast with Terry. You can also check out our social media pages on essentially every major outlet. Just search for AMP or your publication of choice. And that's where the really timely news as it pertains to maritime, the shipbuilding initiatives, as well as anything else pertaining to AMP will get posted as soon as the news breaks. As always, we thank you all for listening, and please come back soon to check out another new AMP podcast.